This video is produced for the course entitled The Bible in American Politics, Theo 298F, taught at Concordia University. This is week 9, part 2 of the lecture, Conquering for Jesus, the Politics of Spiritual Warfare. Now, in the first part of this lecture, I talked about how Wagner eventually systematized this idea of spiritual warfare and presented a three-level worldview of how Christians engage in combating the forces of darkness. The last section is dedicated to, if you recall, strategic level spiritual warfare, where this idea focuses on territorial spirits, on specific supernatural entities that would be responsible for certain geographical areas, regions, nations, cities, counties, neighborhoods, and they hold certain people spiritually captive under their rule. So if they're over a particular region, they can influence what is happening in that region. Now, Wagner wrote several books on spiritual warfare. He dedicated some of those books to the idea of trying to figure out in the Bible where this information comes from. Of course, he bases his spiritual warfare theology on some of the personal experiences that he had with encounters of what he considers to be demons or demonic entities. And trying to look back into the Bible to legitimize those experiences. So what we're going to do now is just focus on a couple of passages from the Bible, because the course is dedicated to the Bible in American politics and how the Bible is used in some of these groups, by some of these groups, in their ideas and how their ideas shape and influence American politics. So where does he get his ideas? How does he legitimize this notion of territorial spirits? There are a couple of passages that we will look at, some in the Old Testament, or what is called also the Hebrew Bible, and a few in the New Testament, a couple of references there too. So let's start with where this comes from, at least his understanding of certain texts that would refer to territorial spirits. The first one is, as you can see on your screen, is found in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 and 9. This is a common translation. This is the New International Version, and most Bibles have that translation, where it says, "When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. For the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotted inheritance." So when you read this text, it just says that God has divided nations, and the nations themselves are divided in such a way that it corresponds to the number of the sons of Israel. So sons of Israel were 12, so that the nations would be divided according to the sons of Israel. Now, this is a reflection of a particular translation, but you have a variation of verse 8, a very important variation of verse 8 from another translation, which is not a translation from the Hebrew text, but a translation from the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, the version that is called the Septuagint. And that version has something slightly different when it comes to verse 8. And what's interesting is that the New Revised Standard Version has kind of retained what the Greek Septuagint has in verse 8 compared to other translations like the New International Version. Now, in the Septuagint, you can see on your screen Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 and 9, but you have a larger portion here. But let's just focus on verses 8 and 9. It says, "When the Most High divided the nations, and when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the nations according to the number of the angels of God. And his people Jacob became the portion of the Lord. Israel was the line of his inheritance." Now, what you have here is quite different. So the nations were divided according to the Greek version of the Old Testament, according to the angels of God. So nations were divided amongst the angels of God. So the various angels of God had certain responsibilities towards the apportioned nations that were given to them. The angels of God, or sometimes they're called the sons of God. This is different than what we read in the translation that we had prior, which was the sons of Israel. Now, scholars are pretty much of the opinion that the version, the Greek version, reflects the most archaic form of the text. So originally, probably it was a reference to the sons of God, or the angels of God. Now, what are these angels of God? They seem to be supernatural entities. The idea now is we're not sure if these supernatural entities are good or bad. So it's hard to determine the fact that these would necessarily be bad entities. It's not clear here. But what's clear also in both of these texts, both of these versions, is that the Lord himself has Israel as his portion. So the portion of God, or the apportioned nation, is the nation of Israel. Now, there's another long passage, and you see it on your screen. We're not going to read the entirety of that passage, but it does describe what some promoters of spiritual warfare have to say about territorial spirits. It's a passage, it's actually the entire chapter 10 of the book of Daniel. Now, we're not going to read the entire chapter, but just to summarize, is that Daniel at one point is a person that's involved in the government under the rule of King Cyrus of Persia. And Daniel was in a moment of intense prayer and fasting. So in verse 3, he did not eat certain foods or have any kind of wine for drink. But he just, for a period of 3 weeks, was fasting. And starting in verse 4, he recounts a vision that he has of a supernatural entity. And this entity starts speaking to him and giving him a bit of information about what was going on and what would happen to the nation of Israel and what would happen to the nations involved in that certain geographical area. Now, when he says, when he's speaking to Daniel, if we read starting in verse 12, he says this. He said to me, and that means to Daniel, "Do not fear, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your words have been heard, and I have come because of your words. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia opposed me 21 days. So Michael, one of the chief priests, came to me to help me, and he left him there with and I left him there with the prince of the king of Persia, and I have come to help you understand what is to happen to your people," that means the people of Israel, "at the end of days, for there is a further vision of those days. And then it continues in verse 15, while he was speaking these words to me, I turned my face towards the ground and was speechless. Then one in human form touched my lips, and I opened my mouth to speak and said to the one who stood before me, my Lord, because of the vision, such pains have come upon me, and that I retain no strength. How can my Lord's servant talk to my Lord? For I am shaking, no strength remains in me, and no breath is left in me. Again, one in human form touched me and strengthened me, and he said, do not fear, greatly beloved, you are safe, be strong and courageous. And when he spoke to me, I was strengthened and said, let my Lord speak, for you have strengthened me. And then he said, do you know why I have come to you? Now I must return to fight against the prince of Persia. And when I am through with him, the prince of Greece will come. But I am to tell you what is inscribed in the book of truth. There is no one with me who contends against these princes except Michael, your prince. Now you have all sorts of princes. You have an angel speaking to Daniel. Daniel has fasted and prayed for 21 days, has this vision. Angel talks to him about having been in a conflict, in a kind of a battle, and now he's here, but he has had help against the prince of Persia from a certain Michael. And then after he delivers his message to Daniel, he must return. He's going to have to battle against the prince of Persia again. Michael will help him, but when he leaves, the prince of Greece will come. Now, all of these princes are in this text references to spiritual entities that are over specific geographical locations. So there was an entity, at least in the book of Daniel, how it's recognized and understood, at least in the book of Daniel. The writers believe that there was a spiritual force over the nation of Persia, which is modern day Iran, but it used to be called Persia. So there was a spiritual entity over that region. There's a spiritual entity over Greece that controls the activities, the political activities, even the military activities of Greeks. So when you leave, the Prince of Greece will arrive. When I leave, this is what this entity is saying to Daniel. And Michael, your prince, is the one that helps me to fight against these forces. So Michael was recognized as being the chief supernatural entity that was in charge of the nation of Israel, or the people of Israel. So you see, this is another example of territorial spirits or forces that are over certain geographical areas, that control certain populations, that have a certain kind of influence over a particular territory. Now, he bases, of course, Wagner develops all of his spiritual warfare ideology on passages from the Bible that kind of exhibit these ideas. Now, these ideas, and if there are such things for Wagner, such things as territorial spirits, that means that they control regions of the world. And these forces are responsible for different things. They're responsible for what happens politically. They're responsible for what happens militarily, what happens spiritually, socially, at the level of even economics. They're responsible even for various natural catastrophes, disasters. They're in charge of a particular region, and they're also responsible for the resistance that missionaries have when they go to certain countries and they try to preach the gospel, the resistance comes from these principalities and powers. And Christians have to battle these principalities and powers in order to make a breakthrough with the gospel. We have an example of how there are consequences when supernatural entities control certain areas, certain areas of the world. Wagner is going to, at one point, in 2011, he said something about the relationship that the emperor in Japan has with the sun goddess. And there is a ritual, he's going to explain this very briefly, but at one point, something happened between the Japanese emperor and what Wagner considers to be a demonic spirit that is seen or understood as being the sun goddess, and that has had certain consequences on the Japanese economy. So watch this clip, and we'll discuss it briefly after.
There is a spirit called a harlot, a principality, who dominates nations, who dominates territories, who dominates people groups very, very clearly, to such an extent that she has fornication with kings. I can give you an example of how she does this. Japan, as a nation, is one of the nations of the world which has consciously, openly invited national demonization. The sun goddess visits him in person and has sexual intercourse with the emperor. It's a very, very powerful thing. So the emperor becomes one flesh with the sun goddess, and that's an invitation for the sun goddess to continue to demonize the whole nation. Since the night that the present emperor slept with the sun goddess, the stock market in Japan has gone down. It's never come up since.
Now, as you can see, Wagner associates the economic crash in Japan to this supernatural entity. He's going to say essentially that because there was this ritual, and because this is an annual ritual, the entire Japanese society is it opens this entire society to demonization. So people are essentially under the control of this demonic entity, which is the sun goddess. You see the type of perception that people that adhere to this kind of spiritual ideology have of other cultures, religions, beliefs and practices. They essentially characterize these beliefs and practices as being, in a nutshell, demonic, undesirable, and against God. And their goal in penetrating these societies is to battle these demonic forces so that the gospel message, which they see as a kind of message of liberation against all these demonic forces, will be able to penetrate and transform the society that's there. So it's a kind of spiritual colonization that you're witnessing, because for them, the superiority of the Christian message is evident compared to these what they consider to be primitive forms of demonic, in their lingo, demonic types of religions, beliefs, cultures, and practices. Now, Christians are responsible to battle these forces also, to engage in some kind of spiritual warfare. We've seen this in the passage that we've read in the book of Daniel. Now, there is an example of this reality for at least people that embrace the ideas of territorial spirits, on how to engage these people and how to recognize when, not these people, but these spirits, how to recognize when you're faced in this, if you're facing this battle yourself as a Christian. If you're engaged in spiritual warfare, which is strategic level spiritual warfare, which is this battle against territorial spirits, there are consequences on your life. I want us to just watch very briefly a short clip from Cindy Jacobs, who is a self-proclaimed prophet, a Neocharismatic self-proclaimed prophet, and a good friend of the late C. Peter Wagner. And she talks about how to engage in spiritual warfare against territorial spirits.
Another is the ability to withstand large amounts of spiritual assault. One of the great battles in possessing the lands, in being a leader, into going into a place of leadership, you will find, is that you become a bigger target, not only for individuals to criticize you, as I shared earlier, but also for the demonic realm. We say new levels, new devils. And each time God will send you into a new arena where you'll be given greater spiritual responsibility, there will be higher level of demonic powers that will target you. And many times, if you're not careful, you will just think it's your natural self or that you're feeling depressed. But the territorial spirits over the area that you're trying to take, particularly if it's a geographic area, will try to manifest through your emotions. Remember that the mind is the battleground. Many times when I will come into a new region to possess the land and to pray over that land, even as the airplane is touching ground, I will bind the principalities and powers that are in that area from influencing me, from affecting me or my family or whatever in any way, or any members of our team. We need to be smart. In fact, sometimes, I'll just tell you a little tip, I used to find myself, after I would pray over an area or come home from ministry trip, I would begin to feel kind of depressed on the airplane coming home. And I later understood that I needed to take authority over the spirits, even the demonic spirits that might have come attached to the people in the plane. For instance, they might be feeling depressed. They might be feeling all kinds of emotions, and it's being projected into the spiritual atmosphere and can affect you. So I sometimes will bind the powers of darkness that are influencing, from the people on the plane. And so, this is just, in a way, you think, well, of course, that's common sense.
So you can clearly see that Christians that are engaged in spiritual warfare will also suffer some types of consequences. But she's talking in a way that, people, at one point she mentions when she's coming back from some of these countries where she engaged in strategic spiritual warfare, even demonic spirits attaching themselves to people on her way back in the plane, and she has to combat these supernatural entities through all sorts of techniques and ways of battling these forces. We have examples, as we saw, and they take those examples from the Bible. There's, of course, prayer, intense moments of prayer, intense moments of fasting. There's this idea of binding the spirits also. And we'll come back to that in part 3. There's this idea also of warfare prayer, ideas around walking in certain neighborhoods where you feel that people that are not receptive to the gospel need to be liberated. There's this practice called prayer walks, where people walk in canvas and canvas certain neighborhoods or areas in certain cities or in certain countries, and as they're walking, they're praying and binding spiritual forces that they deem are controlling individuals and the activities of that given region, which are kind of things that resist the gospel, and by their engagement in spiritual warfare, they will liberate these places for the gospel. So we'll continue talking about some of the techniques that are used in this engagement of spiritual warfare, and how some of these techniques adopt a very, very strong political rhetoric, and how through things like warfare prayer, some of their political adversaries are essentially demonized. So tune in for part 3.